For decades, NATO's alignment in the Arctic operated in the background. There were no constant headlines about Greenland, no daily debates over northern basing rights, no urgent alliance summits focused exclusively on polar strategy. The High North was important, but it was stable. Stability in this context did not mean inactivity, it meant predictability. The Arctic was governed through layered understandings. NATO members with Arctic territory, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Canada, and the United States, coordinated quietly. Military exercises occurred. Surveillance flights were routine. Naval patrols followed established patterns. These actions did not signal crisis. They reinforced a shared assumption that alliance alignment was structural rather than situational. This distinction matters. Structural alignment does not require constant reassurance. It rests on deeply embedded habits, joint planning processes, interoperable forces, shared intelligence frameworks, and decades of institutional familiarity. When these systems function smoothly, they become almost invisible. Political leaders rarely need to restate them because they are treated as foundational. Economic actors absorb that stability as well. Shipping routes, undersea cables, satellite coverage, and resource exploration in northern latitudes are planned against the backdrop of assumed alliance cohesion. Even when tensions exist with external powers such as Russia, coordination among NATO members has historically been regarded as reliable. In that environment, the Arctic was not apolitical, it was simply predictable. Defense planners could project force posture years ahead without revisiting the basic question of alignment. Energy companies evaluating Arctic exploration did so under the assumption that alliance governance would remain consistent across electoral cycles. Investors priced risk based primarily on geography and climate, not alliance variability. This quiet equilibrium did not eliminate competition. Russia has long expanded its Arctic footprint. China has expressed interest in polar shipping routes and scientific presence, yet NATO's internal cohesion in the region was generally assumed to be constant. That assumption created efficiency. When alignment is taken for granted, coordination costs remain low, planning cycles shorten, trust requires fewer formal reassurances, budget allocations follow established doctrine rather than reacting to rhetorical signals. The Arctic, in this sense, was a theater defined by continuity, which is precisely why the shift that followed was not immediately obvious. Nothing collapsed. No alliance member withdrew. No treaty clause was revised. Yet when strategic geography begins to enter public bargaining language, even hypothetically, the background assumption can begin to surface. And when assumptions surface, they are no longer invisible. The shift did not begin with a treaty violation or a military incident. It began with language. When discussions surrounding Greenland and Arctic positioning entered public bargaining rhetoric under the administration of Donald Trump, the reaction across NATO capitals was measured, but attentive. There was no formal policy change. No legal process was triggered. Yet the mere fact that Arctic territory was framed, even hypothetically, within a transactional context, introduced a new variable into alliance thinking. This was not escalation in the traditional sense. It was reframing. For decades, Arctic governance inside NATO had rested on the assumption that territorial integrity and basing arrangements were structural commitments. When public statements implied that geography could be revisited, even rhetorically, that assumption became visible. What had once been background alignment moved into foreground discussion. The response was subtle but concrete. On February 11, 2026, NATO formally launched Arctic Sentry, a coordinated mission to strengthen alliance presence in the High North. Officials described the mission as routine reinforcement of deterrence. Surveillance, joint exercises, and rotational deployments were presented as continuity rather than reaction. That framing was accurate in one sense. NATO exercises are not new. Arctic patrols are not unprecedented. Yet the timing carried interpretive weight. When visible coordination increases following political signaling, observers, both allied and adversarial, register the sequence. The signal was not that alignment had collapsed. It was that alignment now required explicit demonstration. This distinction is subtle but important. A system operating on assumption does not need public reassurance. A system operating under potential variability often does. The Arctic signal therefore consisted of two parallel messages. First, that the alliance remained intact. Second, that planning now incorporated the possibility of strategic uncertainty tied not only to external actors, but to internal political dynamics. Nothing dramatic changed in force posture. No new territorial claims were advanced. But the Arctic moved from background equilibrium to monitored theater. And once monitoring becomes visible, neutrality no longer rests entirely on habit. It rests on proof. Once the signal is absorbed, the system does not fracture. It reorganizes. After the rhetorical shift around Greenland and the launch of NATO's Arctic Sentry mission, Allied governments did not respond with confrontation or public rupture. Instead, they began reinforcing coordination mechanisms in ways that make alignment less dependent on assumption and more dependent on structure. This is how institutionalization begins. Military planners expanded joint Arctic exercises and deepened interoperability protocols. Surveillance integration increased. Northern basing infrastructure was evaluated not just for capability, but for redundancy. These steps were not framed as defensive reactions to an ally. They were framed as prudent planning in a region of growing strategic relevance. From an operational standpoint, nothing dramatic occurred. The Arctic had long been monitored. Exercises had long been scheduled. What changed was frequency and framing. Planning cycles began to assume that reassurance should be visible, not implicit. That visibility carries meaning. When alignment becomes something demonstrated rather than presumed, alliance behavior evolves. European Arctic members, Denmark, Norway, and others began quietly strengthening regional coordination among themselves. The United Kingdom emphasized its vital role in Arctic presence. These moves do not signal distrust. They reflect hedging. Hedging is not separation, it is diversification within the alliance. This distinction matters. The adjustment is not about replacing U.S. leadership. It is about reducing the degree to which short-term political language in Washington can alter long-term strategic posture in the high north. Institutional depth becomes a buffer. Budget processes reflect this shift. Arctic-related capabilities, ice-capable naval assets, radar systems, satellite monitoring move from occasional funding priorities to recurring line items. Once embedded in multi-year defense plans, these commitments become self-reinforcing. Reversing them would require active political effort rather than passive neglect. Corporate actors adjust as well. Energy firms and infrastructure investors monitor not just military presence, but alliance cohesion. If Arctic governance appears increasingly managed rather than automatic, firms factor that into long-term risk assessments. Some projects proceed unchanged. Others incorporate contingency clauses or higher required returns. None of these adjustments produce headlines. Trade continues. Diplomacy continues. The alliance remains intact. But a quiet transformation takes place. Alignment shifts from habit to architecture. In systems theory, this is the difference between equilibrium and active stabilization. In equilibrium, balance is maintained through inertia. In active stabilization, balance is maintained through continuous input. The Arctic, once governed by inertia, begins to require input. That input, more exercises, more budgets, more coordination, may enhance resilience. It may also increase complexity and cost. Either way, it signals that what was once assumed now needs maintenance. And maintenance, once normalized, rarely returns to invisibility. The adjustment does not look like crisis, it looks like budgeting. When alignment shifts from assumption to active maintenance, the first visible consequence appears in defense planning cycles. Arctic patrols require funding. Ice-capable naval assets require procurement. Satellite monitoring requires contracts. What was once a stable baseline becomes a standing priority. For NATO members with limited fiscal space, this can introduce trade-offs. Every additional allocation to Arctic readiness competes with domestic infrastructure, social programs, or tax relief. The sums may not be extraordinary in any single year. The structural nature of the commitment is what matters. Multi-year defense plans create recurring obligations. Over time, that recurrence reshapes public balance sheets. There is also an economic signaling effect. When a region is treated as strategically sensitive, private actors recalibrate expectations. Energy and mining companies evaluating Arctic projects may require slightly higher projected returns before committing capital. Shipping firms may favor route diversification over route optimization. Insurance markets may incorporate marginal risk premiums tied to geopolitical sensitivity. These are not dramatic shifts. They are incremental. But incremental cost increases can accumulate across sectors: energy, telecommunications, maritime logistics, undersea cable redundancy, additional cybersecurity layers, and enhanced surveillance integration all improve resilience. They also add expense. In macroeconomic terms, this introduces friction. Defense-related industries may benefit from steady demand. Aerospace firms, naval contractors, and surveillance technology providers could see durable order pipelines. That activity supports employment in specific regions and sectors. Yet defense-driven growth differs from trade-driven growth. It is less directly tied to consumer productivity and more tied to strategic maintenance. The multiplier effects vary. Allies face their own cost dynamics. European Arctic states may increase spending to reduce reliance on short-term political variability elsewhere. That can deepen institutional independence while preserving alliance membership. However, greater autonomy can also complicate burden-sharing debates within NATO. Markets observe these shifts quietly. Bond investors monitor fiscal trajectories. Energy markets watch long-term supply assumptions. Global capital allocators evaluate whether Arctic governance appears stable or continuously managed. The key cost, however, is not financial alone. It is cognitive. When strategic alignment must be demonstrated repeatedly, policymakers and planners devote time and energy to reassurance. That energy is not available for other priorities: innovation, trade facilitation, or domestic reform. Opportunity cost is rarely visible, but it is real. None of this implies deterioration. The alliance remains functional. The Arctic remains governed. Cooperation persists, but the character of stability changes. Stability maintained through habit is inexpensive. Stability maintained through constant reinforcement is durable, but more resource intensive. The question is not whether the cost is catastrophic. It is whether the cumulative effect of institutional thickening subtly lowers flexibility elsewhere. And that brings us to the final question. The Arctic today is not defined by rupture. It is defined by reinforcement. The alliance has not fractured. No member has withdrawn. No treaty clause has been rewritten. In many respects, NATO's Arctic posture appears stronger and more coordinated than before. Exercises are visible, planning is integrated, commitments are reiterated. The question, however, is not about capability. It is about permanence. When alignment requires active demonstration, it changes the nature of stability. What was once assumed becomes managed. What was once embedded becomes supervised. That shift may enhance resilience in the short term. It may also alter expectations over the long term. If Arctic governance remains visibly reinforced for several years, planning norms may adapt accordingly. Future defense budgets could treat Arctic readiness as a permanent structural line item rather than a variable one. Allies may continue building redundancy into coordination frameworks. Institutional architecture thickens. Over time, that thickness can become self-sustaining. The alternative pathway is subtler. If political rhetoric surrounding Greenland and Arctic positioning fades, and if coordination proceeds without further signaling shocks, alignment could gradually return to a quieter baseline. Exercises would continue, but without interpretive weight. Planning would remain robust, but without the need for reassurance. The difficulty is that once assumptions are tested publicly, they rarely return fully to invisibility. Actors remember the moment when alignment required proof. Markets remember when strategic geography entered bargaining language. Allies remember when contingency planning moved from optional to routine. This does not predetermine confrontation. It does not imply breakdown. It suggests that the High North may operate under a new equilibrium, one where alignment is strong but continuously maintained rather than passively inherited. The long-term trajectory, therefore, hinges less on spending levels and more on repetition. If similar signals recur, institutional thickening becomes entrenched. If signals remain isolated, the system may slowly relax back toward assumption. In either case, the Arctic has moved from background geography to foreground governance, and once a region enters that category, it rarely exits entirely. The open question is not whether NATO remains aligned. It is whether alignment will once again feel automatic, or whether it will remain something that must be actively sustained for years to come.